Welcome, everybody, to the VeryBusy.io Wrap Party podcast. We host a bunch of guests and cover a variety of topics here related to retouching and photography. I'm your host, Peter Hunner, and today we're talking all things printing with Kevin Kornemann of Lightprint, based out of New York. Kevin, you've been in the industry for over 30 years. You've covered a lot of different roles from, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but photo assisting, high-end retouching, drum scan operator, digital technician, color management consulting, printing, all these things that you've excelled at in these roles during your career, which has now culminated in your current company, Lightprint. Well, let's hear a little bit about Lightprint. What exactly are you guys doing at Lightprint? Who do you serve? What are you working on?
In the New York sort of lab space, photo lab space, there seemed to be kind of a void in an online web to print solution. There's plenty of labs in New York, plenty of big labs, but none of them seem to have an online component that was really pushing the work, the orders. So that was kind of the impetus of it. It was actually two websites for a long time. It was CMYK Proof and Lightprint. So I just kind of merged them over, the last 4 or 5 years, because it was just too much to manage two brands. So CMYK Proof, that was running for probably 15 years. Lightprint's probably running for 10 years. So the idea behind having the two brands was, proofing was graphic arts, designers, packaging designers, also retouchers, whereas Lightprint was fine art, printing, G-clay, photographers. So it was a different target audience, but it just became too much to manage, and I merged them.
Everything's under Lightprint now.
Yeah, and now it doesn't matter. No one cares. Like, it was such a big deal, and I was like, because proofing is a big part of my business. Proofing is something I've been doing for at least 15 years now.
Yeah, and it's a big, we've with my retouching studio, Honey, we've used your services, and a big reason we went with you, especially for East Coast stuff, is how efficient it is to place orders with you, how fast you guys do turnarounds and shipping, and the actual shipping of the product. You guys do a stellar job at it as well, for commercial proofing and, getting my clients proofs for our work. It's I don't know how simpler it could be. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that greatly. It's all custom built, so I'm not going to say it's perfect web experience, but it was designed specifically for what I call creative professionals. They're working in Adobe products. They're not, like drawing something in their iPad or trying to send me an iPhone photo, right? They're working in Photoshop or InDesign or Illustrator. And so it's just the way it was designed was just feed me the files, straight up to the website, check out. That's it. It's not meant to be interactive. We're not trying.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the next best thing to having, your own proofing.
Site, on the other hand,
digital proofing versus, we're the other side of it, for VeryBusy is, the digital proofing side of it. But, everything's always getting more streamlined. And, on that topic, between all these things, between digital and then proofing and how these industries they progress quite fast. I mean, I guess, I'm going to ask you some questions later just about, the future of print and new things that are coming out. And you have some cool actual print types you've been working on. But from, what got you into printing to begin with? I know you've held a lot of roles throughout your career, but how did you end up here?
Well, I started, you want to go all the way back, making fake IDs in my basement.
There we go.
Yeah. So, and not a lot has changed really. I mean, it's just things have just gotten bigger, but it was all a process. But yeah, so I've always been really into the photo process.
Yeah,
doing just back then in high school, doing really crazy photo composite work to make these fake IDs, pre-computers, right?
Amazing.
I would microwave chemistry because I didn't have any way of heating.
Right. Amazing.
Microwave parents were like, "What's that smell?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's kind of where it all started, that sort of passion for photography, fascination, really, obsession, maybe, that I'm sure a lot of retouchers can relate to, retouchers, photographers. But it was totally analog back then, and back then it was like, oh my God, when digital comes, everything's going to be amazing. This is going to change everything. It's going to be so great. And now I'm like, I want to go back to analog.
Yeah.
I'm like, so a lot of what I do is trying to keep analog processes alive. You know, with digital, we're still printing from a digital file, right? I'm not going back to an enlarger, but a lot of the printing, like chromogenic and silver gelatin, these are true photographic processes that are just digitally exposed and chemically processed. So as close as I can get to that analog in a digital world.
It's an important part too, keeping some of that stuff alive. I remember going through college, over a decade ago, almost 15 years ago, we had alternative processes classes. We did black and white before digital, and it was a nice, it was more fine art based school, but I thought it was really important to learn some of that, especially if you're getting into photography, the history behind it, but also, from a non-digital standpoint, how it used to work. Because with light and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's still relevant today, but the outputs could be different. But yeah, so it's nice to see people like you keeping these things around, though maybe a bit of an updated process.
And yeah, as far as how I got into printing. So when I first moved to New York, I was working for a web studio, and I remember thinking this. We work on this website for 6 months. It's going to exist for a year, and then it would just disappear. And I was like, I need to get this off of the computer. I want it to exist in reality. So that's kind of why I do what I do. I want it to exist in reality. To spend all this time just for it to flash on an iPad for a few seconds.
A short-lived piece, yeah. Something that lasts.
Which I would imagine all retouchers can identify with as far as the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into an image. And then,
Yeah, it's gone in an instant, and they're on to the next one. Next season, next product, next whatever.
Yeah, I mean, on the side, I still do my own work, and for me, it's like I'm not going to be backing up hard drives and putting up a portfolio somewhere, and be like, here's my work. It's like in reality, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we retouched, let's say in the aughts, like I can't even get access to that stuff. If I want to bust out a CD-ROM and like,
isn't that the truth? Well, that's another thing is like, from your time earlier on to now, what are some of the significant changes you've seen? I mean, yeah, you went through era, in terms of like printing in that though, what have been some of the more important like evolutions of maybe the process or that you've seen?
Yeah, so I would say like 2006, 2007, that was the year or years that digital capture just took over. I mean, I don't know how far you go back, but and I remember that's when I started teching. I bought a Phase 1 P30 Plus.
Yeah, the P30 Plus.
Okay. So you old enough to remember that?
Yeah.
So yeah, that was kind of like the marker for me, 2007-ish, around there. And that's when I got into teching. I was doing teching and retouching at the time. So that was a big marker in like, because before that, photographers, the professional photographers I was working for, they didn't take it seriously. They're like, that's never going to happen. I'm always going to shoot my film. They believed it. And then it was like almost overnight, we're never shooting film again. It was just,
Isn't that amazing? Like that critical mass or that point of it was good enough and the capabilities of it did happen fast.
And then as far as printing, I mean, the Epson, and around the same time, right, the late aughts, that the Epsons really started to come out, like the 7900 and 9900, the 11880 was a big one in the fine art world. These are all Epson series. Canon came out. I tried to get into Canon. I never really got into Canon for various reasons, kind of pros and cons to each of those. But Epson really was the one that like everything changed. We became an Epson shop pretty much exclusively. I've got at least 5 back there right now, all sorts of various sizes and functions, and so I mean, digital, that P30 Plus, and then the late aughts, the Epsons coming in, and then everything kind of changed. Up to that point, a lot of the stuff was done on Lambda, LightJet. I don't know if you're familiar with those names, but those were C-print machines that were really designed for commercial. The Lambda especially was a commercial C-print machine. The printer
and that's essentially printing from, you're projecting, was it a laser light or
laser light? That, and the Lambda, the paper was moving as it was being exposed.
Got it. Yep.
The LightJet, it's internal drum. It's more like an enlarger in the sense it comes on the drum and then it gets exposed. So it's stationary while it's being exposed. So the printer I have is a Poly, which is kind of the last evolution in C-print technology. They still exist. They're still making them. They're in Italy.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Light jets, they haven't made them since 2005. Lambda's probably a similar year since they stopped making those. So yeah, it was, that was kind of the aughts was when that change really switched. But, I can't say that I always felt fulfilled by Epsons the way I did by these conventional processes, meaning like it didn't kind of grab me in the same way,
Like in terms of like quality or in like depth and color.
Like it's an emotional response, like without sounding, overzealous. It's an emotional response that I don't really get from Epsons the way I do from a C-print. Like this behind me, that was taken on an iPhone.
Amazing.
But that's a real photo print. That's a real chromogenic print that's been face mounted to acrylic. And it gets me in that kind of emotional response way that an inkjet doesn't. And, I'm not going to say I don't also have that wow moment with inkjets, because I do. It's just, it tends to be more the illustrations. When we're printing artwork and illustrations and, where you can have really vibrant colors and everything's really banging, like the white's banging, the color's banging.
Yeah.
It looks great for illustrations. But for photography, I still prefer the C-print and silver gelatin.
What in terms of your transition from earlier on in your career, I know about what time you actually worked with Jill Greenberg in helping her set up her retouching studio. When you were setting that up, was it just solely about retouching that, or there was also a printing portion of that, or proofing, or can you tell us a little bit about that time?
We had a Fuji, I want to say it was called Fuji Picture Proof or something. There was two. I don't want to confuse. Fuji had a competitor to the Kodak Approval. I don't know if you remember.
Kodak Approval, I remember. Yeah.
Okay. So there's the Fuji Final Proof was the competitor to the Kodak Approval. I had multiple Kodak approvals during my career, like 3. I never had a Fuji Final Proof, but when I worked for Jill, like brand new technology back then was this desktop drum scanner. It was called an Optronics. Side note, the founder of that company is the guy that makes Image Print. I don't know if you've heard of that company. It's a software for printing on Epson.
Nice.
I'm sure people have heard of it. Image Print. I don't want to plug them necessarily, but because I think there's better stuff, but which I can get to if you want to talk shop. But anyway, so yes, I was right out of school. And like I said, I worked for a web developer. Jill was friends with these web developers, and she kind of coached me. And I was a kid in the candy store at the time because like I could buy all this cool equipment. She was doing very well as a commercial photographer, shooting camel ads, massive budgets. That whole time period was a bit like me and the photo assistants, like because she lived in her studio here in New York on 28th Street, and like there was just lots of musicians coming in, lots of big projects with crazy budgets, and
there was a big work.
It was just kind of a raucous environment. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, but definitely that was like early retouching days. I mean, like that was the infancy, I would say, of retouching. And we definitely weren't shooting digital, right? We were scanning film. She'd have to rush the film back from the lab. I'd have to throw it on the drum scanner, start retouching on the super slow computer. Yeah, right. Like, I had life in that job.
Were there some big takeaways from that experience in terms of like, setting up this whole kind of process, or
I guess I learned a lot from film scanning. That's when I kind of figured out how to do that. That was the beginning days of color management. That was important. Like back then, we couldn't make a profile. We'd have to send it to this company called Profile City, and it had a service for like making profile. It was just everything was really, really hard.
It was truly in its infancy. Like,
and I was still using a mouse at that point. Wacom was still like, what's that? Like Quantel Paintbox was still around. Like this is super. Like I don't know if you remember that, but that was, they had a tablet that was like anyway. But after 2 years, it was like I felt like I'd paid my dues. I've beat myself up. I didn't get any sleep most of the time.
Oh, good.
Like, it was a great environment to be, but I was like, I got to move on. So I actually was trying to shoot. I was trying to be a photographer. I was assisting, and I was freelance retouching, and was like, I should just do this as like my profession, because seeing other people doing it and doing very well for themselves, especially back then, because it was so early.
It was a pretty new practice in the digital realm, I assume. Like,
And there was, there was still a ton of money being directed into that area, in a way that I don't think exists today. Things had to get printed. Things went to magazines, Things were in ads. They were ad campaigns in a magazine, not, campaigns on an iPad. It's just, so there was a lot of money being pumped into that. And you really had to kind of know what you're doing. Like, because if you messed up and that magazine came out and like the girl's arm is like missing, there was all sorts of stories like that. So, and, it's printed. So resolution becomes a real issue, you have to, and it's film. So you had to watch out with film grain, which is way harder than digital. It's just, it was, anyway, but eventually the market changed, I changed, things changed, and I got out of it. Yesterday we had a client come in and they were asking me to do retouching. I'm like, okay, but I'm going to charge you a lot. So I'm not going to say I don't come out of retirement, but, and it's been, it's invaluable, as having that background as a printer.
Yeah, totally.
Like, there's definitely people in this business that I come across that just don't get it.
I mean, like a background in post plus, and retouching, plus knowing heavily, like the knowing about the printing process and what is needed for that too, because that's where the work goes. Like it's a big part of how, you will be prepping or perhaps retouching a certain image. It could go back that far. So, yeah.
I'm happy to talk shop as far as like, what I see when people submit files.
Yeah, well, I would love to, because you went stepping back really quick from, your freelance retouching and then now moving into your printing era, and then now with light print, and you've been focusing on print, these last how many years, and the amount of files I can imagine you have been sent, you have seen with your eyes, you've needed to adjust, you've needed to get feedback,
well,
all these different things. In a simple sense, starting at the basics, what are some common issues you see? Say somebody, go both ways, either proofing or fine art printing. Let's start with maybe proofing. If somebody has a project to proof,
that's fairly straightforward, actually. So these websites, which is proofing and fine art printing, like I was kind of doing those concurrently as I was retouching, and retouching was kind of funding those for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you can relate. And then eventually it just kind of got to a point where I was like, I don't have time to sit on a box. It's time consuming, like retouching. But from the fine art perspective, if most people, I feel like they know, okay, tag it as Adobe RGB or sRGB, one of those, doesn't really matter. People have preferences. Some people like this Pro RGB. I'm like, I'm not one of those guys. I'm just like, Adobe is fine. Or sRGB, neither of them can we hit.
You can't print that large.
So, it's bigger than anything we can hit. So both are fine. But from a color management perspective, sometimes people will tag their monitor profile, and that's wrong
too. And I think I'm not sure how exactly that happens. I've always tried to figure that out. It's like unless I don't know.
No, I can tell you, it's because people think, okay, I calibrated my monitor. I spent $200 on this color spider or whatever. Calibrated my monitor. I should load that into my stuff. Then it follows every file they produce.
Wonderful.
Because it's getting embedded. So, and then I open it up. It's not a big deal because that gamut of that monitor is going to be big.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, it's one of those things I'm like, because it's not a working space. It's right. So in your color settings, always set sRGB or Adobe. Leave it at that. Your CMYK should be whatever, shouldn't be swap. It almost should never be swap, which is the default. It should be whatever you're proofing to. So Grackle 2013 Graco 2006, ISO coded V2. These are all proofing standards that we proof, CMYK proofing standards. So set that to whatever you're proofing to.
Yeah, a common thing I do is I always ask my clients, how are they going to be printing these? And a lot of times I try to ask for a contact from the printer to know what kind of profile they need loaded. Because sometimes they have custom profiles, especially for other presses and stuff. So,
that's kind of an ideological debate as far as printers that want to have their own custom or the standards. The people that make the standards, who I know through color management groups, that's not what they want printers to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Is to hit the standards. It just makes everything easier for the rest of the
consistent.
world.
Yeah.
And they can. They're just kind of being lazy, at least from their perspective.
Yeah.
I don't deal a lot with offset printers, which is a little ironic because, we do a lot of CMYK proofing. Most offset printers that know, that have some color management chops, have their own proofing system, know Grackle, know how to hit it. That's another misconception. There's something called G7. This is something I see a lot too, where I'm like, I have to correct you. So G7 is a methodology to calibrate an offset printer or any printer, including an inkjet. It's a calibration method. So there's G7 certified printers, G7 certified technicians. All it means is they know how to use this methodology to calibrate a printing press or a printer. It's generally for CMYK. Actually, I think it's all exclusively CMYK. So that's G7, but Grackle was built on G7. So sometimes those terms get interchanged or mixed up. People are like, we need a G7 proof. I'm like, it's a Grackle proof. But okay, I get it. Anyway, this other things, other sort of issues, like when designers are dealing with Pantones, they'll rename them. That's always an issue when they're doing spots and it's CMYK builds. They don't give us any idea of what the build is. There is a convention as a best practice to put the name of in the name, the CMYK build. So cyan 0, magenta 50, yellow 25.
Yeah, so they know exactly.
Put that in that's another convention that's kind of preferred. That makes it easy for us. This is spots, which in Pantones, which is not really this packaging clients.
Design.
Sizing files. I'd say that's probably the biggest thing that I run into on a daily basis with fine art. To just, here's the file, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to have to size it. Are you okay with that? Because it's going to do, we use Topaz to upres files and, there's some voodoo going on there.
Yeah, I've built that software as well too with upres. Like it can do a nice job sometimes. Like it's pretty impressive of what it can do, but it can make some changes.
It's one of those things that's better than nothing, but it's nothing is nowhere near as like the real thing. Resolution, good resolution. This. That's something that like excites me.
Yeah.
Good resolution, lots of it, sharp. Those are things I get excited by.
Well, you should.
Some clients, the photographers, solid background, and I'll get that. But I wish I could say it was more often than not. I don't know. I've been getting a lot of scans lately, film scans. So, and that there's a whole new change there. Instead of drum scanning, we're now using cameras and film.
How does that work? Is there like an adapter for how does that work?
So I don't want to plug anybody, but there's a company that makes a kit that you can buy, and they're pretty affordable. I have like their super duper package that was not affordable, but they make some that are pretty affordable for like just $35. But it's basically a light box and a copy stand. So you're looking down on it, on the film. And the way I think of it is it's an inverse of an enlarger, right?
Okay, yeah.
So for me, it's a much better result, a much more natural result as it relates to the film grain and the resolution that's coming out of that.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Because there's some dispersion going on, more similar to the way it would have been in a enlarger and, hitting paper.
Well, that's cool.
Versus a drum scanner, which is like it's a microscope focused on film. Like that's what a drum scanner is, with light shining into it. Like, and you would get kind of weird grain noise drum scanning. It's still today. People are like, I need a drum scan. I'm like, this is better.
It sounds like a lot cheaper and faster process too, is it?
Oh yeah, no. It's one of those things. It's kind of a pain to set it up, because everything's going to be perfectly level. There's all sorts of tricks to getting it like totally square from the film to the lens. You've got to have a good light source. Like the light booth is rated for pure color. They call it a CRI rating, color rating index, I think. So you want a high color rating for the light box, and it's even to render the film, as best and accurately as possible. So there's these sort of things, and then you need a sharp lens, macro lens typically, and then high resolution on top of that. Anyway, but yeah, once it's set up and running, and you can fly through like a roll of film very quickly. It's a huge change if people are shooting film from scanning on a drum scanner.
I remember that. I remember using an Imacon, and I think it was Hasselblad had it before that. Was it? I can't remember. But it would take like 15 minutes to do like a nice scan, and then it was such a laborious process at times. And then you'd find a whole bunch of dust on it. You have to go back and dust it off, and I don't know. It was no, thank you. So sorry, go ahead.
Well, so you see film scans. That's kind of been newer lately.
Well, I think we had talked in the pre-pro bit, kind of film having a bit of a reemergence, or it has a number of years now. I think there's all these people still kind of shooting that aesthetic and that. We actually just worked on a job for a global company who shot half in film, half in digital. Awesome. And they had us match the treatment to the film, the digitals to the film. So it's cool to see that still there and happening, and the processes that are surrounding it, like this new scanning way of doing with the camera, digitizing your film. It's that's nice. That's nice to see.
It's nice you had that reference at least, right? Like
that is a nice thing, because half the time they'll be like, we want a film treatment. It's like, well, what kind of, okay, well, what does that look like? Like, what kind of film treatment do you want? Is it, so it's not always nice to have the reference. But on that point, just thinking about that project, what are you kind of leaning back on just from retouching and out and printing and that? There's always a lot of questions about, if I'm going to only be printing a file, should I be retouching only in CMYK? Should I only be doing that? Or should it be, kept in RGB for your main file and then converted and treated that way? Do you have a preference?
Oh, yeah, the latter, 1,000%.
Keeping it in RGB, keeping it full gamut kind of thing.
Yeah, not to keep going back in the day, but back in the day, that was a real hurdle where people were like, you can't retouch an RGB. You don't know what you're doing. Like, that separation to happen so work can be done there. Because packaging has special requirements, there can be all sorts of special requirements. Instead of going to CMYK, they're going to CMY and a Pantone, right? Like those sort of things that, you need to convert it for packaging. Like that's kind of really the only, or you want a specific black. We have something we used to do back in the day when we would convert black and whites to CMYK. We would use a special profile that had a long black. So most of the file was black, meaning like when you converted it and looked at your channels, from 0 to 100, like in the black channel, that was most of the information. And the color only.
Ring.
Sorry, I lost you. Hold on one second. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Someone's trying to reach me. Anyway, so we call it long black. It's also known as max GCR. So, and the advantage of that is if you were sending it to a magazine and you didn't really control how it was being printed, what they were getting, the image was made of all black ink, and the color would only go into the shadows. So from page to page, the black and whites would be neutral-ish, right? Whereas if you give them a standard CMYK profile, it's called a skeleton black. There's no black, right? So the black only goes into the shadows. All of your canned CMYK profiles in Adobe, they're all skeleton black profiles. There's no GCR. So if you want to get creative with your GCR because it's a 4-color black and white, that would be another reason that you might want to work in CMYK. But even then, it would be a last step, always. We always kept masters in RGB, and the CMYK were throwaway. They were disposable.
Yeah, it's keeping, all that information. It's a lot easier to retouch, I feel, in RGB. Some people like to control the different channels and stuff in CMYK, but in terms of latitude, it's always seemed like an easier process. And then converting for your color, that's how we do it. I think there's only one time and it was at a request of a client where they had a product. We had a project that was both for digital and print that they wanted CMYK first. So they wanted the fastest process to get their CMYK for print, so I start proofing and all that kind of stuff. So what we ended up doing was any of the digitals we were proofing, we just converted to sRGB, even though the color wasn't as nice as the RGB, and they just wanted those, which I don't know, seemed a little weird if they're going to be for digital. But yeah, it's a lot easier. It makes a lot more sense.
I mean, for me, except for those use cases, edge cases, if you will, like I don't want to color correct in RGB. Like that's not how I think. I think in RGB when I'm color correcting. Color correcting by the numbers. I could think completely RGB. I had a client recently. It was like, there's this book, and I won't name the book, but where everything's done in lab, and I'm like, I don't think in lab. I think in RGB. Why would I want to make things harder?
Right?
Like, I mean, that's kind of another point to like all this is everyone is like, this is the right way to do it. And I kind of got to a point where I finally was like, there's a lot of different ways of doing something. It's like, what are you the most comfortable with? What are you going to get done fast? Yeah. What's going to work? What is going to yield you the best result in the shortest amount of time? I'm very opinionated on that. I have a lot of opinions on that, but people want to, sit there and tweak CMYK values, go nuts. Like,
I mean, I like taking opinions from experienced people because they've gone through it, and most of the time has found the best solution for difficult situations.
Yeah, but there's just endless, especially in the digital world, there's endless ways to treat something. To process something. It's like I still can't use Lightroom.
I've never been a fan of Lightroom. Because each their own, but yeah.
I started with Capture One, and I have to pay $30 a month for something I rarely use, but it's worth it because it's Capture One.
Yeah, I've always preferred Capture One as well. But yeah, I want to move on to first of all, just a quick overview of that. Working files always in RGB, then converting to the specific CMYK profile you need for color, any color correction for proofing or whatever you need. But when we go into printing now, whether it be proofing or for fine art, we have another topic of paper types or substrates and optical brighteners, which I think is a hot topic for you. Can we talk a little bit about that? Like, for those wanting to do fine art prints, printing their own work, maybe for a portfolio, for a gallery, for any of this, what's the best way to go about choosing paper, prepping for it? And, if whatever printer they're working with, or maybe they're doing it themselves at their home, what do you see as the best way to the most successful print?
Well, I would say a couple of things. It's worth investing in custom profiles. I couldn't work without custom profiles. And on top of that, we use device link profiles, which is a different, in color management, there's ICC profiles and device link profiles. All of what we do in proofing is device link profiles. So it's very sophisticated color management, I'd call it.
And by profiles, are you talking about profiles for
printer profiles?
Printer profiles, yeah.
Yeah. So, if you buy a paper, you can find a canned profile, I call it.
Yeah. That's the one you go to like the supplier's website and you download it.
And it's for that printer on that paper. Generally, it's going to be pretty good. I couldn't work like that. I don't, because with proofing, it's not even a possibility. In the proofing world, there's two device link profiles. There's the calibration device link profile, and then there's the proof standard calibration. So there's two levels of color management going on in proofing, and then there's the Pantones. So it's uber complicated. In most of your fine art printers are working at home, or if you're a retoucher working, in a studio, small studio, you're just going to be using the ICC CAN profile, and that will work. But if you can invest in some system that can give you a custom profile, it's worth it, in my opinion. So that's the first thing. You have to know how to produce it. You have to turn off color management in whatever driver or RIP you're using when you print that chart. That's another
whole process there to do that. But
as far as optical brighteners, so in the proofing world, let's talk about fine art first because it's a little simpler. we've got a number of curated G-Clay papers on our website. We've got some Epson, some Moab, some Hahnemühle, and they're pretty much, one's a matte, a burrito, a luster, a matte, for each of those kind of price tiers. Only the Moab doesn't have OBA, doesn't have optical brighteners. So both Hahnemühle papers, even though it's the more expensive option on our website and the more expensive for us to source, both the papers that we use from Hahnemühle have optical brighteners. The reason they can be an issue is that over time, well, let's talk about what they are. They're basically embedded into the paper, and they reflect light. They kind of phosphoresce, if you will. The problem with that, it's great because when you look at it under light, it's going to reflect the light brighter than it would be if it wasn't there. But over time, that phosphorescence or intensity of that will die. So what happens is essentially the print will yellow. The white will tend to yellow. And it's kind of everywhere in almost all inkjet printing papers. It's also in traditional chromogenic and silver gelatin, but in a extremely lower amount. Yeah. But it's not a bright as white on a C print or a chromogenic print out of the box, right?
Yeah.
Out of the box. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, if you're doing fine art, you might want to consider, do I care about optical brighteners being there, or I don't care about optical brighteners? If you don't care, your initial result is going to look better. It's a brighter white. It's going to have more impact. It's going to be poppier. It's going to be kind of closer to a photograph, especially on like a burrito.
Okay. Yep.
Like one of my favorite G-Clay papers is Hahnemühle Fine Art Burrito. And it's the closest thing to me to a traditional photograph in color. It's very heavyweight, nice rich blacks, and it's got a bright white, but it's got tons of optical brighteners. If you want to test, you can buy a black light at Spencer's and shine it on your paper. And it sounds silly, but it's really useful. I use it all the time because you can suss out very quickly what papers do or don't. And I've actually, there's a vendor that I buy from, LexJet. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're an inkjet vendor. They deal with photographers, but I think they're more signage. But they straight up told me, this is archival matte paper, no optical brighteners. We got it here. And I'm like, this thing is like glowing neon when I turn on this black light. And it created a problem because I actually had built all these profiles on top of this paper for a client, and that specific client could not. It was a textile client, and because it's textiles, there's no optical brighteners in a textile, so they could not have optical brighteners at all. So we had to switch them to a fine art paper to proof, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I mean, actually, that whole experience was where I really kind of learned how important optical brighteners could be, because my client was like, look, I take this outside and it's a completely different color. And I'm like, yeah, right.
So not only the longevity and maybe the yellowing over time and like non-archivalness of it, but also it can affect color in different lighting.
Right. So optical brighteners respond to UV light, basically. Some lights indoors have UV light, some don't. And actually the light booth behind me, it has a specific amount of UV light per a spec. Right, which was something that was decided upon, back in 2013 when they released the new specs. And we said, okay, these bulbs now need to have UV light, but it's a specific amount. So there's consistency among, all the vendors. So yeah, so when you go outside, when they're taking their proofs outside with their samples, their sample, which was a textile, would be, a yellow, and the proof would be just glowing blue because of all the ultraviolet hitting those optical brighteners. So the same thing will happen to your fine art print. So where it gets displayed, how it gets displayed, how much sunlight is hitting it, all that sort of stuff will
matter.
Change the appearance of it if there's a lot of optical brighteners in there. The flip side of a non-OBA paper is it's going to look yellow out of the gate, right? It's going to, it's a very common paper that we use, Moab and Trotter rag, and there's no OBA, but it's cotton rag, and it's got like a yellow tint to it. So That's the drawback, is that you have to be, it's like, well, do I want it to yellow now or later? It kind of comes down to that.
When printing on like a non-OBA paper, though, even though it's a bit of yellow paper, I assume maybe like highlights and the whites, of course, will be the yellower. But in terms of color, you can reproduce color pretty accurately on it, or is that another trade-off?
So the white of the paper really affects color. Like, it has a tremendous effect on the gamut of your result. So if you have a nice bright white on like a glossy paper, that paper's gonna have a big gamut. Depending on the inks, obviously, but you throw on, a matte non-OBA, cotton rag where it's yellow, it's going to have substantially less gamut. So, and then, obviously matte and Burita, matte is like a chalky black versus a photo black. In Epson world, they call it matte black. So the very different visual appearance between, say, a C print, or Burita inkjet. Like, those two are fairly comparable, and then, like a matte, which is more like a watercolor paper. Like, to me, that's how I classify inkjet papers. It's kind of those uncoated matte, or which is matte black, or some sort of coated paper, which is a photo black. Those are the main two categories, and then it breaks down from there. So I mean, it's one advantage of the C print, of the chromogenic print. It's got a lot less optical brighteners, but it still looks banging and still looks photographic, nice, beautiful photographic range. I feel like C prints excel over inkjets with glossy. In fact, we don't even offer glossy for inkjet prints. Because if you want glossy, you got to do a C print. Like, that's
What is what do the inkjet prints lack that you see in?
It's because the ink is just kind of like getting laid on there. And it's ink instead of dye, right? It's those two things. So with gloss, the ink is kind of sitting on top. And they've made a lot of improvements in this area. A long time ago, there was something called bronzing, where the blacks would kind of like solarize the inkjets, and they seem to have gotten rid of that. And every generation of the Epson is better blacks, for sure. And it's dyes versus ink, really. I mean, and it's continuous tone versus essentially a simulation of continuous tone. Yeah, I think when we talked, I was last time I was talking about how, for me, an inkjet was still a bit of a reproduction, and a C print was more of an original photograph. I know there's people that are gonna disagree with that statement.
Everyone's gonna have their opinion on that one, right.
But that's how I feel. I feel like people that have experience with C prints would agree with that statement. But I also think that people that are getting back into film, but then printing on an inkjet, are kind of missing half the equation. And not every, some people are printing in a larger, they're printing silver gelatin in a dark room, and that's amazing. For me, I would never want to I'd never want to use an enlarger again. That's why we have computers.
Well, I mean, I like the meld that you have in terms of like updated tech, but and some of the other processes. And before we were kind of getting tight on time here now, but we talked about the glycine and technically speaking, inkjet prints. But then you guys are also doing C prints, of course, CMYK proofing, but you're also doing digital silver gelatin, correct?
Yes.
And maybe ongoing metal prints too. Do you want to talk about those two quick? The digital silver gelatin sounds interesting. I've never experienced that or seen that before.
They're pretty unique and pretty beautiful. I mean, you can't, like, side by side. They're kind of, actually an Epson tech told me they're objectively better.
Yeah.
And that's a lot, tech, right? Like, he wasn't saying that about mine particularly, because at that point I wasn't doing it, but he had done work for another company that was doing it. And there's only a handful of people doing this now. It's a real pain in my butt. Honestly, we do a lot of G-Clay, and obviously we do a lot of proofing. That's so much easier. Like, I can't even explain, even begin to explain how much easier it is, from silver gelatin print to even a chromogenic print. The chromogenic's not too bad, but the machine I have, it's really, a laborious machine to maintain and run, and it's just making a
And then you're
print
still
is
dealing with chemicals and time and all. I mean, there's a lot of things there that digital solved for to make that process easier.
yeah.
But I
So
mean, you
and
sacrifice in quality at some points.
well, it's just it's a lot of work, and it's a matter of the market, if how long the market will sustain those products.
Yeah.
I my shop is not sustaining it. So it's really, Kodak is already gone. It used to always be there was Kodak and Fuji. Now it's Kodak's gone. So it's just Fuji. It's a matter of when Fuji decides, we can't make C-print material anymore. We can't
Yeah.
make chemistry anymore. And I don't know. It's probably 10 years. And I'll get some metal prints on that note. Metal prints are interesting. I've seen some really beautiful stuff done on them. I've done some testing here internally on actually like a film type substrate, like it's a plastic substrate.
Yep.
Like I have the dye sub printer already. I need a giant heat press to do what's called Chromolux. That's the brand name for the metal prints that you'll see out and about. Anecdotally, I'm told they don't last, and I'm sure people will get upset about that too. So the metal prints, if it's Chromolux, it's a dye sub, right? So you're dealing with dyes the same way you're dealing with dyes with a chromogenic print. So they have a similar visual impact. Mm-hmm. In fact, similar to the acrylic, because we're face mounting C prints to acrylic, the metal prints have kind of a similar result with a lot less work. A lot less work. It doesn't have quite the same resolution, and that's Fuji Crystal Archive, so it's going to last. Fuji Crystal Archives, you're good for 75 years, 50 to 75 years. Depending on exposure to light. It's a whole other conversation. We didn't really talk about that with inkjet. We can, I'm happy to, but with the metal prints, because it's dyes will fade faster than ink, but it doesn't have the same visual impact as as dyes, right? But because metal prints is a dye sub that's, getting transferred, those dyes can fade if they're exposed to a lot of sunlight. And I've heard pretty quickly. So that's kind of I think in the fine art world, they're still not quite taken seriously. Whereas the pigment prints, here in New York, I've gone to a couple shows, and pigment prints have just taken over. It's just they're everywhere. You'll still see a lot of silver gelatin in shows. You'll still see the occasional C print, and I'm always like, oh, it's a C print. But yeah, pigment / G clay, whatever you want to call it, have really kind of taken over for fine art. But I did see a metal print at the last photo show I was at, and I was kind of surprised because I do know this thing about it, maybe fading faster than a C print or an inkjet. But I have been told they're working on it. They being Epson,
okay.
They've gone through a couple generations of these dye subs already, and so it means that you got to buy another one. I've got I think the first generation, they're on the second generation. So I'm kind of waiting to see what happens with that. If Epson releases a more archival dye sub ink set for metal prints, I think when that happens, that's going to be a real game changer. Maybe more analogous to when Epson came on the scene with just inkjets.
Nice. We'll have to look out for that then.
I know I won't be able to keep C prints around for more than maybe 10 years. I mean, sadly. I don't know. Maybe, who knows?
For the best. And people did say, I guess film is slowly dying out, but things still keep popping up. Here and there, people have a response to it, are willing to pay for it, right? And
I'll say, just as far as the archivalness of the C print versus inkjet print, I think we talked about that before. Fuji Crystal Archives built to last. The inkjets, they've been tested for longer, but my position on that is it's dyes versus ink, number one. Continuous tone versus a dithered simulation of continuous tone, number two. This optical brightener issue can be an issue. Not always if you're using non-OBA paper. By the way, if it doesn't say on the box no OBA, it probably has OBAs. But you can always test it with that black light. But yeah, the other thing with the archivability of all these things is it's all about exposure to light, not time. They get rated in time, 75 years, 100 years, 200 years, but it's all about exposure to light. I can take any 200-year inkjet and put it in a window. It's going to fade.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly.
Well, yeah, I mean, like from framing and stuff like that, don't they have like UV blocking glass, and like it depends on exactly where it's shown. Like there are a lot of factors there, and
Yeah,
they're just going to
absolutely.
be sitting up 100 years, you know.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly, because if you're really concerned about archivability, it goes in a drawer
Yeah,
and it's cold stored, like sees no light. Yeah, I want to enjoy stuff I print.
and
See it,
then on
see
the
it.
well, right. I mean, if you're going to print like that, if you have artwork, you want to see it. Well, great. Well, you know what? We already spent our hour, keeping the sea prints alive. Digital and digital silver gelatin print. That's all cool stuff. And it's fun to see. Hopefully, I mean, yeah, they last, they stay around. Maybe there's something new comes up. Who knows? But I want to thank you so much for coming on today. I know you're really busy. You're there in your shop. We can hear you guys working. Before we sign off, where can people reach you? What kind of things you got going on? Anything you want to?
So part of being so old is I'm really bad at social media.
Yeah.
So I have @lightprint the handle, but I never post. The best way to reach me is email, kevin@lightprint.com. So, I mean, that's, if you email me, I will respond. The other stuff I can't. So, yeah. And then, of course, the website, lightprint.com, you can always just go and place orders.
If you guys have printing needs, take a look. It's the reason I met and found out about Kevin was we were in need of a printer over on the East Coast, somebody with fast turnaround, good quality. You guys kind of checked all those boxes. So go check it out. And yeah, thanks again for coming on today. Hopefully we'll be talking to you again soon, and we can kind of deep dive more into some of these more technical things of some of these printing practices, and maybe some good questions come up from these conversations that some of our listeners want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really get too into color management per se, so it's always
that would be another important one. That could be a whole thing on its own, color management. So maybe there's a color management episode for all this stuff. So
okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Peter. I appreciate it.
Hey, man, thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Talk to you.